relationship to the Water Tower neighborhood?
Yeah, my name is NikKovak, N-I-K-K-O-V-A-C. I'm currently the alderman representing the Water Tower neighborhood, neighborhoods west to River West and south to downtown. And I was born on Bellevue and Downer, and I now live in River West.
Could you maybe talk about growing up in the neighborhood? In any way, did growing up in that neighborhood sort of form a path for you to become alderman? Is there any relationships or stories that you have that happened in the neighborhood that sort of gave you a focus to what you wanted to do within the city of Milwaukee?
Well, I definitely feel like being a Milwaukee East Sider has defined me throughout my life. I don't know if you're asking sort of that general kind of question or you want specifics. But yeah, I've lived in other places. I've lived in Madison. I've lived in Boston and in New York and Brooklyn and Queens. And I've traveled, somewhat. And I'm a bit of a sentimental person, but I do think there's something about the east side of Milwaukee, which is it's an unusual mix of incomes and stages of life. Milwaukee is a very segregated city. Certainly the east side is too segregated racially, the whole city is. But you've always had a mix of families, retired folks, college students, young professionals. When you look at the housing stock, obviously Water Tower skews a little bit more towards, less towards young professionals just because of the size of the houses, but it's in such proximity, and Downer Avenue's the kind of, they call it the brick side of Downer sometimes, or actually I only learned that phrase recently, but certainly east of Downer has always had a meaning in Milwaukee. But Downer Avenue is not like the river. It's not really it's more of a boundary, more of a border than a boundary, I would say, or however you want to put that. So there's always been, growing up, Downer Avenue was always a place that people knew. You'd say I lived next to the popcorn wagon, and everybody knew where that was. So I think, and the same thing with Lake Park. Everybody knows where Lake Park is. So even though, the east side of town is certainly the wealthiest part of town, has the grandest houses, it may no longer technically be the wealthiest part of town once you factor in Kilbourne and University Club Towers. Those are actually, in terms of assessment value, probably the most expensive places to live in Milwaukee by far now. Several multi-million-dollar condos there, whole floors of those buildings. And I don't really think there's multi-million-dollar homes, at least not many, east of Downer. But it certainly has that feel of wealth, and potentially, I think in most parts of the world, when you have that kind of wealth, there's also a feeling of exclusivity, whether there's a literal gate or not. And I think that's one of the unique or magical things about the east side, is that because of Downer Avenue and because of Lake Park, everyone's always felt welcome. And I think Downer Avenue has always had a mixture of boutiques, but also really every person kind of shopping options. It's never felt like, you can go to some suburbs and some main streets in some suburbs like Cedarburg, and as charming and as historic as downtown Cedarburg is, it just sort of feels like a lot of useless knickknacks, to be blunt. Whereas Downer's always had, we used to have 2 grocery stores, not only as one. It used to have 2 drugstores, I think. It has a bakery now. It's always had a coffee shop, or not always, but most of my life, there used to be a place called Webster's. There was even a car repair, be the place where the bookstore and the medical facilities are now, was historically like a 4-story car repair place, which is pretty unusual that you've got multiple-story car repair. And then I think the popcorn wagon and the fountain, which is now the really just outdoor seating for Hollander, but that used to be a fountain outside a laundromat. So imagine that. A laundromat in one of the, like, sort of the main street in the wealthiest part of town has a laundromat, which I think speaks to what I'm talking about, because I mean, generally speaking, everybody east of Downer probably has a washer dryer, right? But there's a whole lot of renters west of Downer, and by west of Downer, I mean just a few steps. I mean, there's apartment buildings right there. So there's a huge demand potentially for people who maybe don't have a washer dryer. And I think my parents may not have had a washer dryer when they first bought the house in 1975, actually. I think they used that laundromat. So I was born in 1977. And I remember growing up that Otto Wentz, who was still alive, who used to run the Sentry where the CVS now is, he used to sort of chase the skateboarders off the fountain. And people would the reason I remember the fountain connected to laundromat so much is every now and then somebody would just take their extra soap and put it in the fountain. So during the summer, more often than not, you'd see bubbles everywhere, and you'd have skateboarders. And it's not like the police were coming to mess with people. Otto Wentz, who ran the grocery store, would come and mess with skateboarders and try to chase them off. But I think it was really a gathering place, and it was a well-known, iconic place. And I certainly think the destruction of the popcorn wagon and the construction of a really ugly and basically useless parking garage compromised that. I hope not beyond repair, but in the short term beyond repair. It really made Downer less iconic, and it damaged a lot of people's faith in city government, including mine. That's why I'm here, because city government was making wrong decisions for the wrong reasons, and it was clear and it was obvious. You know, the emperor had no clothes. So I mean, that's really the only reason I'm here. I mean, I shouldn't say the only, but it's the, but for that, I wouldn't be here. I'd be doing something else. But for the need for change, specifically around the built environment and the public process around changes to the built environment.
Could you maybe go into detail of the parking structure for the viewers listening?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe talk about why the parking structure was placed there. Was there a new plan for what Downer was going to be, and did it fall through? It seems like it's a large place to park for nothing right now.
Yeah, well, I can tell you this. I don't think there has ever in the history of that parking garage been as many cars in that parking garage at any one time as fit in the surface lot. And the surface lot wasn't always full, but it was often full. I think they had 27 or 29. That number sticks in my head. Is the number of spots that were in the surface lot. And admittedly, a surface lot on a major intersection is not the best use of space. But really the only thing worse would be a parking garage, because, I mean, you want to put your parking garages on the edge of a business district, not in the middle, for, I mean, traffic reasons, aesthetic reasons, multiple reasons, especially that particular parking garage. Its primary users are supposed to be the medical offices, which are across the street and down the block. And I said this from the beginning. I said, it doesn't make any sense, because you've got people coming to see the doctor, maybe with kids or injuries. They're not going to want to cross the only street that's hard to cross in the whole, for 5 blocks. I mean, literally, it's the only street that's hard to cross or that has significant traffic. And supposedly there was a development, they're going to want to park on Stoll. They're going to want to park on the edge of the business district, and they're going to want to, preferably they'd rather not have to go outside at all, but if they do, they'd much rather not have to cross the street. That was obvious and completely ignored. And then as soon as I became alderman, that was the first request I got. Well, not the first, but within a few months of being alderman, the tenants of that medical office building, without appreciating the irony of this, why would they? I mean, most people don't get embroiled in these controversies, called me and said, you need to do something about a mid-block crossing or make it easier for us to cross Downer Avenue, because we're afraid to park. Too many of our patients are afraid to park in the garage. And we did what we could. We tried to, there wasn't a lot we could do, because there really wasn't we talked to traffic engineers, and there isn't a way to do a mid-block. It was tight. To get exactly what they wanted, to get the crosswalk they wanted exactly, was not recommended by the traffic engineer, because it was too close to the traffic light. They don't recommend that, because cars are just zooming through the light. Although there is one north of there, but that's a longer block. So it was one of these things where, so we were right, but so what, right? I mean, it was a colossal mistake. So you asked why. I mean, you're asking me to put words in the mouths of people who are liars, to be blunt. I mean, they lied about what they wanted when they wanted it, and they lied about whether or not the public would be legitimately involved in the process. So you'd be asking me to speculate on their real reasons. I can tell you that their stated reasons were clearly false, and has been borne out by the history of it. I mean, it was clearly a mistake. It's clearly, I mean, ugliness, aestheticism is in the eye of the beholder, I suppose. But the usefulness of that parking garage is an empirical fact. And they built it. They spent $20 million on essentially a useless and ugly and really destructive for the iconography and built environment of the street. Why they did it? I mean, also who's they? I mean, part of the problem was the developer and the alderman. It was hard to tell them apart, and that was part of the problem from the beginning. That it seemed like it wasn't clear if it was the alderman's idea. And by this I mean Alderman D'Amato, or the developer, who is now Joe Lee. At the time was a mixture of Joe Lee and Boris Gachman, or really was more Boris Gachman was the face of it initially. But it wasn't clear whether it was Mike D'Amato or Boris Gachman's idea. The only thing everybody knew was that it was a bad idea, and then Alderman D'Amato didn't care and did it anyway, and used his influence in this building to make it happen, which is really a shame. I mean, I don't even bring this up as a moral issue, because I do think it's a moral issue when you live in a democracy that you should listen to people fairly. Whether you end up agreeing with them or not, you should at least listen to them with an open mind before you make your decision. I mean, it's clear that he didn't. He came to a meeting. I mean, do you want all the nitty-gritty of all the different iterations? Or do you know?
We don't know much about it at
Oh, you
all,
don't?
so,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, what had happened was, and actually some of this happened while I lived in New York while some of it was happening, because I was the editor of a newspaper there. But I came home for about a year, then moved back to New York for a year and a half, and then moved back home. And so I was, some of this I'd be reporting to you as secondhand, because it was stuff that I was getting while I was in New York. Some of it I saw myself. So there was a mixture of meetings I was at, and but it all kind of started right around 2005-ish, I think. And there had been a sequence of city-owned parking lots that were being developed when Alderman D'Amato was in office. I think there were 8 in total that got developed, and 6 of them were sold to the same developer, New Land Enterprises, which is owned by Boris Gachman. And I think most of them, some of this history I'd have to check, because I don't know the full history of those 8. I just know there were 8, and the 8th was Downer Avenue. And they had initially done an RFP, a request for proposals, and I think there had been 8 proposals that came back, for including apartments, boutique hotel on the parking lot site. And I believe through that process, it was narrowed down to 3 finalists, which I can now tell you is relatively standard procedure, where you have sort of a community vetting, and the Department of City Development, along with the alderman, has a role in a selection process. None of the 3 finalists were New Land's proposal. I think, I wasn't alderman then, and I can't remember the exact details, but I know that there were 3 finalists. The one that most of the near neighbors I talked to liked the most was the boutique hotel. And I don't know the details of why that was scuttled. I know the RFP was scrapped, and then it was announced that the lot would be given no bid to New Land Enterprises. The justification given at the time for why it was being done no bid was New Land had also acquired the block to the north and to the west. So the idea was, since it'll be part of a larger development, and since there'll be all these moving pieces, then they'll need parking for this, and it'll be better to have just one developer handle it all and do all 3 phases, which sounds plausible, but frankly was not. Sounds plausible, but was ultimately the opposite of what we should have wanted. Taking aside the fact that the disaster ended up happening, just the principle of, let's take a historic main street and make sure that one person owns all of it, is the exact opposite of what we should want. And that goes back, that's not specific to New Land Enterprises. I would say that about any owner. It was a perfect storm that it was New Land, and they have a track record of building buildings that start leaking and falling apart almost instantly. The River Bridge, the High Bridge, the Sterling all have problems. And then now this parking garage. So I mean, it was a perfect storm of selling it to a developer who's also going to build something not to current construction practices, and there's already cracks, and the garage wasn't even built so that the water will flood out properly. I mean, it's a brand new parking garage, and it doesn't feel that way if you go inside. Putting that to the side, just the principle of you should want your main street to have separate owners, because you should want there to be some competition, and there's synergies that can come from separate owners. The biggest problem that Downer Avenue had in my lifetime was that it had one owner. The city did own that parking lot, but Danny Katz owned the block to the west and the block to the north of the parking lot, now parking structure where the popcorn wagon used to be. And I don't know, have you heard much about Danny Katz?
We have
He was like the Mr. Potter of Downer Avenue from It's a Wonderful Life. I mean, he was a absolute disaster. He still owns a lot of property in Milwaukee, and
Does he still own a lot of property on Downers?
no, he sold for a very high number to New Land Enterprises, who has since sold to Jolie. But, and like I said, it was a partnership between New Land and Jolie on the parking garage. But, I mean, Danny Katz is, and I'm happy to say this publicly, I've said it a million times publicly, I mean, he's legendary for being a completely unreasonable lease negotiator, and for, I mean, what he's legendary for, he owns a lot of apartments, but what he's legendary for on Downer Avenue is he'd much rather ask for a ridiculous amount of rent and not get it from anyone and leave half the street vacant than get a reasonable number from everyone. Which on its face, and I still don't know the full story, and maybe you can dig around and ask people about Danny Katz. I mean, I don't know you hear rumors, oh, he's just doing it all as a tax write-off, he wants to lose money on it. All I know is that he would consistently ask for more rent than the market would bear, and he would get it from whoever he could get for as long as he could get. And, you know, he's asking for $30 a foot or more. If he can't get it, somebody might be willing to give him 20, but he'd rather just take zero for years. So there were several spots that were vacant for years, which seems like that can't be the right way to do business. But that was the way he did business. I know I have some personal knowledge of this because my dad's best friend was Jimmy Hugg, who ran the Downer Avenue garage, which ended up moving to North Avenue. So that's now where the, what is it now, an open pantry or 7-Eleven? It's now where the 7-Eleven is on North Avenue and where Classic Slice was for a hot minute. But I can tell you that, well, you maybe should just ask my father. I don't know if you're going to, I know you talked to my mother. But the negotiations over on that were not friendly, and those are the negotiations I know the best because I've heard the stories from my father. But I also talked to many of the people who used to rent there, and that was the story. So, and when one guy or one LLC owns the whole block, you kind of have that option. Because you own so much, you can sort of say, well, I'm going to hold these spaces vacant to keep this place. Whereas if you have multiple owners, you know, smaller scale, you can't afford that kind of what's the way to put it? I would call it like robber baron style, where you basically are trying to run. You know, you've got a number that you want to hit, and you're willing to lose money in the short term because in the long term you know you're going to make money because you own the whole pie. And so that robber baron mentality that Danny Katz had was certainly harming the street. And I think at first when Danny Katz sold, there was this huge sigh of relief, like, oh, maybe things will get better. And I certainly think that Boris and well, now it's really Joel, do not have that problem. It did take them a little while, and there's still some vacancies. But ultimately, I don't know the details of all the rental agreements, but I know that Joel has attempted to fill those vacancies. I think the biggest thing working against him is probably that the high number he had to pay Danny Katz, or had to pay Boris, who had paid Danny Katz. So whatever the number on the note is, I think it was $13 million. for those 2 blocks is high. But you do see you see that the movie theater and the bookstore have survived, and I think they've been reasonable on the rent to help them survive. You see that you had Olive and Gossip move in, and now Olive is still there. You've got the liquor store expanding, the bakery is still doing well, the laundromat moved to new space, Pizza Man moving in. So there's starting to be the rumblings of a reasonable capitalist actually just trying to make money every year. So that's been great for the street, and it kind of shows you that the street was always held back a little bit by this Danny Katz. I mean, the worst thing not the worst, but the thing that's the most galling is that there was this gelato shop that had opened down the block, kind of near where the bakery and the liquor store are. Just small mom and pop operation, and it was starting to do well. And he responded by opening up Licks. I don't know which he owned. So the landlord just opened up his own ice cream shop on a better corner and ran the gelato shop out of business, but they had a long-term lease and they had to keep paying him rent. I mean, that's the way he thought. It was just sickening. So there was actually, for a while, a lot of neighbors were boycotting Licks for that reason. So, I mean, the Danny Katz situation was really, really bad. But to be frank, it was preferable to the current situation, because at least he didn't own the popcorn wagon in the parking lot and destroy the iconic centerpiece of Downer Avenue, but then also really build something that made the street feel a lot less historic and charming, and was also less useful than what it replaced for the exact same purpose it was replacing it. Because, like I say, less cars parked there than before. I mean, that's kind of a roundabout. But so the justification for why we've got to no-bid this to one person or one entity was it'll be better if the same person owns the whole block. I'd say the exact opposite is true. Case in point is the Kitty Corner block, the block to the northwest of the parking structure. It's owned by CVS, which used to be owned by Century, but then Otto went sold out to them. Brett Grassi of Lighthouse Development owns the middle piece that has the physical therapy, the Pancake House, and Via Downer. And then the hardware store owns the hardware store, and the Sendick family owns Sendik's. So you have 4 different owners and no vacancies. Okay? And so the blocks that have always, and that's been historically true. And I think we'd be much better off if we had that kind of ownership, 4 to a block, on all 3 or now all 4 corners of the Downer Avenue. Well, the parking structure corner is really just one lot, but the other 3 where you really have multiple buildings there, it'd be much better if different people owned them. And you don't need to take my word for it. There's no principle I'm defending here. Just look at look at the facts on the ground. The one block with multiple owners has no vacancies. The blocks that don't have multiple owners have had vacancies through Danny Katz, through Boris Gottman, and now through Joe Lee. Like I say, I give Joe Lee credit for being more aggressive about filling those vacancies than Boris, and certainly Danny were before them. But the one danger, though, when I say it was almost better under Danny, or is at least as bad as, and it's obvious why it's bad for the neighborhood, I think, when a landlord is looking out more for his own profit than for the community services that can be offered by having shops open on a main street. But at least Danny Katz's ambition was just about maximizing his rental money. He wasn't thinking, how can I tear down half the street and build some new shiny thing? So that's been the real danger, and that was really what galvanized the whole neighborhood. Was the parking garage really came out last minute. I mean, initially there was a proposal for an 11-story condo. The proposals kept moving, and even since I've been alderman, the proposals have been moving. And to be honest, some of the ideas are good. I mean, a hotel is a really good idea. I mean, a hotel, there's no East Side Hotel now, at least north of County Clare. But I mean, there's no, in the Hotel Astor, there's no hotel. You end up in Glendale if you want, and you've got a university and a hospital, and you've got the nicest neighborhoods in Milwaukee. And why wouldn't obviously university, people visiting sick relatives, or people visiting the hospital, and people going to the university are going to want a hotel, so that could be your main driver. But then increasingly your business or your pleasure travelers are not looking to stay downtown, they're looking to stay in neighborhoods. That's an obvious neighborhood where you can walk to Lake Park, it's 3 blocks away. I mean, a hotel makes a lot of sense, and a hotel would be the best thing possible for the merchants. I mean, those are, especially, like I say, you've got a lot of bread and butter shops. I mean, you've got literally liquor store, bakery, grocery store, dry cleaner. You know, most people traveling probably aren't going to need a dry cleaner. If they're staying in a hotel, they'll just rent the iron from the front desk. But the kind of shops like the Majoli, the Gossip, the bookstore, the movie theater. I mean, yes, local people support all those shops, but having 100 people, you know, traveling, being in the area will help those shops immeasurably. Because I know that was always an issue. I mean, I certainly, I put a lot of the blame on Danny Katz, but it, you know, Main Street, small-scale retail is suffering throughout this country because of Walmart and globalization. So I can't put the whole blame on Danny Katz on why there were vacancies on Downer Avenue. But I would say that if retail can work anywhere, it ought to work in the part of town that has the highest average density, has a higher density of disposable income than anywhere else in the city. It ought to work on Downer Avenue. And so, but there's still challenges.
Could you talk about the
Yeah.
challenges of getting something like a hotel in?
Yeah.
If you were for that and you feel that would benefit the
Mhm.
owner,
Yeah.
what are the challenges from your point of view that are tossed at you that
Right.
make it not possible?
Right. Well, yeah. Maybe I should start talking maybe about how we're going to going forward. It's kind of a long story to explain just how such a bad mistake as that parking structure happened. So I'm sort of going through all the iterations. So there were all these other things being talked about, and then at the last minute it was like, but before we build anything else, all this other stuff that some of you really want, some of you are going to be against because it's change. Some of you maybe want to see the details and evaluate them before you make up your mind. But never mind all that discussion. We've just decided as a city, and this is what Alderman D'Amato announced at the first town hall meeting where the parking garage was unveiled. We've decided that the developer needs all this extra parking, and we've decided to put it there. And if you don't like it, come to the zoning meeting and complain about it. So two things. I mean, one, you always want to make the right decision, and that was clearly the wrong decision, and then he was stubborn about it. And again, that's not a matter of opinion. Like I say, just walk into that garage and see if any cars are parked there. But the idea of telling the public, you know, I as the alderman have made up my mind, and if you don't like it, come complain. And if you do complain, I'm going to accuse you of being anti-urban and anti-development. Is really obnoxious and insidious, and was so damaging to the neighborhood that I think I really have seen my role in the last 5 years to try to repair people's faith that when you come to a public meeting, it's not a sham, and you're not going to be verbally abused for having a different opinion than the powers that be. And so I honestly think that process is still ongoing, because I think the bitterness is that deep. I think it's really, looking back on it, it's hard for me to think of how it got quite that bad. And you'd really have to ask Alderman D'Amato his opinion on what he was thinking. I mean, I've talked to him about it, and but nothing he says is coherent about it. I mean, it's clear what was really going on. But he'll just say, "Oh, I'm an urbanist," and anyone who doesn't want bigger buildings should go live in the suburbs. I mean, that was a common thing he would say, which is very frustrating because a lot of these points are very subtle. I think. I mean, these issues of how does an urban Main Street recover when the challenges facing it are not, yet it had a bad landlord for 2 decades. But it also had larger problems, like I say, Walmart and globalization. And then also in Bayshore. I mean, suburbanization is a threat, and it is a problem, and the current politics in Wisconsin indicate, the Republicans don't live in the cornfields. They live in Mequon and Waukesha. I mean, that's where the Republicans live. I mean, the cornfields are 50-50. The people that are the most anti-city people are the people that live closest to the city but never come here. So that is a so it's a subtle issue. There's a lot going on there, and having a city government that basically took that city-suburban tension and responded with a ham-handed, simple solutions to problems that are to development. Like this, but when I say ham-handed and simple, I mean basically bigger building in city good because cornfield sprawl bad. End of story. It's like, no, I agree, bigger buildings in cities good, cornfield sprawl bad, granted. But that doesn't mean that we're for every cornfield, although I don't have that's a different question. But it doesn't mean that, more importantly, since I represent the city, it doesn't mean we're for every big building in the city. It means that, yes, overall, more density is good, overall. But the details really matter. And I would argue that on development, you asked me about being a visionary or being a keeper of the built environment. I would say that getting the details right is actually much more important than having your first principles right when it comes to development. Because I think if you look back at the history of all the good ideas we've had in development, I don't know how closely you've read, Jane Jacobs or followed the history of public housing and freeways and urban renewal. What tends to happen, probably not just probably going back thousands of years, but certainly going back 50 years of American history, what tends to happen is progressives get a good idea, or I shouldn't say a good idea. Progressives have a good principle, namely, like going back to how the other half lived, in Lower Manhattan. What was that guy's name? Jacob Riis, or not Jacob? You know that book?
The photographer, Jacob Riis.
It was a Jacob Riis. Okay, so he writes this book about how bad the slums are, and the slums were terrible. And I don't want to say that the solution was worse than the problem, but the solution created its own new problems. Put it that way. I think you could probably argue that New York public housing today, and I know New York, I was a journalist there for 4 or 5 years, when Jacob Riis wrote that book, people didn't have plumbing. The disease was ridiculous. The way people were packed in. So tearing down some of those slums and putting up what used to be shiny new towers of progressivism, which have then now turned into the biggest drivers of economic urban segregation, not just in New York, but everywhere. It's like, well, at least people have indoor plumbing, at least there's a base level, there's a safety net. But at the same time, you've made these buildings that were purposely ugly because you thought if they looked good, that it would be a waste of government resources for people who aren't, quote, earning it. But you basically created a model where the poor stay poor. And you could argue that in the Jacob Riis days, there was actually more upward mobility. Maybe because the conditions were so bad. Anyway, I'm getting kind of far afield. My point being, that's one example, the idea of doing these public housing towers and tearing down existing slums. There's an example of an idea that you could argue either way, but in actual practical application, what happened in city after city was they didn't necessarily tear down the slums. They tore down middle-class black or Italian neighborhoods, or they tore down neighborhoods that were buffers between white and black neighborhoods to make segregation worse. So the idea of some of these really old, cheaply built houses really weren't meant to last, and we shouldn't let the poor keep living in these awful conditions. We've got to do something about it. It's a good principle, but in practice it ended up, Mayor Daley, not the father, not the son, famously built the freeway to protect his neighborhood, which worked to this day. It's this little white enclave in South Chicago because they tore down a black neighborhood and put up a 12-lane freeway as a moat. Borchert Fields, Walnut Way in Milwaukee is well known. I've interviewed Mayor Zeidler about this, and he's still proud of it, which is interesting. He stuck to his guns. But my point being, most progressives have looked back on urban renewal, which was actually their idea, but was co-opted by racist business interests. Not to put too fine a point on it. And they've realized, we should have done it just a little bit differently. So that's when I say ham-handed and simplistic, that's kind of what I mean. Like, there's a current principle out there which I agree with, which was Mayor Norquist's principle, which Alderman D'Amato more or less agreed with, which was, let's have new urbanism. Let's have density on our main streets. I agree. But I think that doesn't, just because your first principle is right, doesn't mean that your 2nd through 20th principles or details have to also be right. I'm getting a little maybe philosophical about all of this, but the point being, the details of the design really matter. Whether it's a 3-story or a 5-story or a 10 or a 20-story building, it's got to have a welcoming pedestrian experience, and it's got to react to the buildings around it. People will criticize that sometimes by saying, oh, well, does historic preservation mean everything has to look old? Or no, but it means that when you put up new stuff, it has to react to the old stuff in a sensible way. It has to acknowledge its surroundings. Even the Calatrava acknowledges its surroundings. To me, when I say what's my vision of Downer Avenue, I don't have one thing. I mean, a hotel is like on the top of my list of things we want, but how that hotel looks, whether it's on the north or the south end of the street, how much of a building facade we save, how much of a building we tear down, I'm not going to tell you right now. I don't have a line in the sand saying all the buildings on Downer Avenue have to be saved. I'd prefer that. I prefer to save them all. But if someone comes up with a nice design that preserves most of them and the design will embrace the remaining buildings, I mean, I'm open to that conversation. I think so is the community. And the other thing I tell all developers is no matter what I think, don't expect to get a final answer from me around this table. When I will not call a community meeting without having an open mind about it. Now, obviously you have your principles and there's things people can kind of get a sense that you'll be for or not, but I do think it's important. Obviously it's a moral question because we live in a democracy, but I also think it's practically just a good idea. Go to a community meeting, especially in a neighborhood full of doctors, lawyers, architects, small business owners, developers themselves. Yes, at the community meeting, some people are going to say things that you don't agree with, or they're even going to say things that aren't workable. Some people are going to throw out ideas that just don't make sense financially or even are worse than what you're proposing from a design perspective. But a few people are going to throw out an idea that are going to be like, you know what, that might work. Oh, I didn't think of that. You're right, there is going to be that negative impact from this corner of that building. We do need to acknowledge that. And that's a process I think I've shepherded through on a number of, well, it hasn't really happened on Downer yet because things have been in limbo in terms of, we did actually, that's not true, it has happened on Downer. We did have a meeting, I think about three or 4 years ago. Actually, this is a good example, I should bring this up. 3 or 4 years ago where was it a hotel or an apartment at that point? It's been such a moving target. But I also the fact that it's been a moving target recently, I think has been reasonable. I do think that Joe Lee's been acting, and his son Dan, who lives around the corner on Newberry, have been acting in reasonably good faith in terms of trying to get, like I say, filling the current vacancies, but then trying to think about a hotel or an apartment. But it is very hard to get financing for it. So that it's been a moving target for them to assemble something that they think works for their bottom line. But there was 2 things that we had a community meeting about at the same church, St. Mark's Church, where Alderman D'Amato announced if you don't like it, come and complain at the formal meeting. One was we're going to redo a streetscape, which would involve $300,000 of city aid. And the other was either an apartment or a hotel. I think it was a hotel at that point, where the bank used to be on the north end of Downer. And actually, even before the St. Mark's meeting, we'd had a meeting around a kitchen table at the people whose building was right next to that apartment. And they hired a new architect, not the hack job architect who did the parking structure, which was Scott Kindness and Robert Greenstreet. Kindness was Greenstreet's student, but Greenstreet was very involved in designing that structure, even though he doesn't have an architecture license in America. Kindness is one of his chosen students and designed that thing. But they brought in Matt Rinka, who does really good work, did the Moderne. And he came up with a design that was aware of the surroundings. And actually, even though it was going to block the light of a lot of people next door, on balance, I think the people in the St. Regis and the Georgetown, the buildings on Hackett thought, on balance, if you're going to build something there, it's a good looking thing. We think we can support that. And then we had a meeting at the St. Mark's Church, where it was presented to the wider neighborhood, and people were more or less okay with the new design. But then we talked about the streetscape, and part of the problem with the streetscape is, speaking of Danny Katz being cheap, the old bricks. I don't know. Do you remember before the new bricks were put down 4 or 5 years ago? You know, they kept popping up because he had actually. In fact, I think I might have some here. Yeah, I do. These are the new bricks we put down. These were the Danny Katz bricks. He was so cheap that he cut them in half the long way, so he'd have to buy less bricks. But it meant they popped up, you know. So all of these bricks on Downer Avenue were popping up, and it was a real problem. And it was, you know, I said there's Walmart, there's globalization, there's Danny Katz. These are all problems. But when women in their high heels are trying to go to Majoli clothing boutique and they've got to negotiate these things like this, you know, and it's not good. So it was definitely needed to be done. And the initial proposal from the Downer Avenue Business Improvement District, which 75% of the ownership of Downer Avenue Business Improvement District was one person, was Joe Lee, which is really unusual in the case of these districts. They said, well, we've looked at it, and here's our budget, and we like the brick idea. You know, it's the brick side of Downer, and it all fits in. It's historic Downer Avenue. But we really can't afford to do brick. Brick's expensive, so we're going to do this like stamped concrete painted, which I've seen done. It's not the worst stuff, but it's also not brick. So, I mean, we presented the idea to the community, and a couple people in the community were very vocal. We've got to have real brick, or we don't think we can afford it. After the meeting, actually, some of the people who were vocal, several people went and had drinks at Hollander right across from St. Mark's, and I even did some shuttle diplomacy going from the bid director who worked for Jolie, Jake Provan's table, over to Sandy McSweeney, who was on the Historic Preservation Commission and was being the loudest about real brick. And Jake Provan said, you know, I want real brick. Don't get me wrong. I want it. I'm just worried it's going to be too expensive. But he said, but you know what? If other people want brick that bad, since I want it too, we all would want brick, we'll look into it. And we found a way to make it happen. So now there's the real brick on Downer Avenue, so hopefully it'll last for decades. I bring that up as an example of why having a community meeting with an open mind can work, because it wasn't my way or the highway. It wasn't, there's no way in hell we're doing brick, we hate brick. It was based on our initial review of the numbers and the first 2 bids we got, it looks like stamped concrete's a whole lot cheaper than brick. And we just didn't think it was that big of a deal. Now that we hear from the neighborhood that this is actually a big deal to you, especially given that this is half city funded, we're going to take a harder look at it. And then everybody's happy in the end. I wish that had been the process on the park, because if that had really been the process on the parking garage, at some point somebody would have said, whether it was Dean Greenstreet or the Time Works for the city, or whether it was Rocky Marcoux or the mayor, or Alderman D'Amato can speak for himself about why he didn't have an open mind. But at some point it would have been realized, whew, this is actually kind of a dumb thing to do, to put the parking here, and also it's an ugly building. I mean, there are sort of 2 elephants in the room. Wrong location for that site. I mean, you need parking somewhere, but not right there. And of all the places to put, you know, it just didn't make sense. And an honest community meeting would have revealed that. And in fact, did reveal it. It's just that the people who made the decisions didn't care. So for me, that's the biggest thing about being a keeper of that district now is Pizza Man's another good example, actually. So there has been some progress. I mean, they ripped out our historic roof and put a balcony on, which is not really consistent with what a historic district generally asks for. We don't say, would you rip off a third of the roof and put a modern balcony on the historic building? That's not on the top of the list of requests from purist preservationists. But the plan was presented, changes were made. I mean, not big changes. I mean, they got to tear off a third of the roof and put on a modern balcony, but they changed the materials of the balcony. I think, I'm forgetting exactly what happened, but something was changed about the openings onto the balcony where the windows used to be. And then also the facade was changed. I mean, a number of small changes were made, I think, to make the Pizza Man really successful. So looking at the Pizza Man development, like I think a good case study would be Look at the Downer Avenue streetscape as originally proposed versus what was built. Look at the Pizza Man original rendering versus what ended up getting approved by the Historic Preservation Commission. Both of those things went through a fair and honest community process, and I'm the most powerful person in determining whether that's fair or honest is the alderman. And so I was very insistent both times that it be honest. And I think on the Downer Avenue streetscape, there wasn't that trust that would happen. But I think that the second time around there was. And similar things have happened now. Another good example would be on North Avenue. The D'Amato used the same MO on North Avenue. He negotiated in private with UWM, and he negotiated over one thing and one thing only, reducing the number of beds. And so you ended up with a building that was actually in the primary environmental corridor, forcing us to move parkland, and basically building a building into a bluff, when even though there was vacant land to the west, owned by a combination of the city and the very same developer that was building the dorm. So why we didn't push that building up and make that urban river valley on the west side of North Avenue, respect it the same way we did on the east, same mistake was made. I know you're not talking about North Avenue and the river, but if you look at those two, I mean, that's a good case study. I say if you want to know the difference between NikKovak and D'Amato, stand on North Avenue, look west, look east. The D'Amato process got you dorm to the west. The NikKovak process got you the dorm to the east. And I mean, calling it the NikKovak process maybe isn't the way to do it, but you shouldn't make it too personal, right? Especially if you're going to release this publicly. I don't want to be sour grapes, but so let me put it this way: scratch the NikKovak D'Amato bit. If you stand on North Avenue, the dorm to the west will reveal what happens when the alderman negotiates almost exclusively in private with the developer. To the east is what happens when the alderman has private discussions with the developer that indicate that whatever the public demands, you should try to meet. You don't have to meet all their demands, but you should try to meet all their demands. And then we'll negotiate in public over which demands you can meet and which demands you can't. So the demands, so when Alderman D'Amato negotiated, and I know this because I've talked to this, I was negotiating with the same people. So first they negotiated with D'Amato over the west bed, then they negotiated with me over the east side. D'Amato basically told them the only thing that matters is getting the bed count down, because I'm worried that there'll be too many students. Which, if you actually ask the neighbors, was like the lowest thing on their list. It was the highest thing on the list of people who live near campus. People who live near the Sandberg dorms were like, one more bed and I'm moving. One more dorm room and I'm out of here. I'm selling my house to an absentee landlord. I'm out. I mean, that's the attitude of people who live near Sandberg for good historical reasons. Because you did get several thousand more students, and they tended to be destination students, not commuter students. I mean, that's a whole other conversation. But there's a whole, I mean, here's the map of that, actually. That's not why you're here, but necessarily, but actually, you might find this interesting. This is non-owner occupied residential properties. So you can see the people that live here, you can see how they're now surrounded by renters, and the people who are still scattered in here. And they were on, DEFCON 5 high alert. Any more student housing won't work. But over here, where that dorm went, people were actually more concerned about how the building would look, how traffic and parking would work out, and whether or not the river trails would be respected. And traffic and parking actually did work out. I mean, there are some neighbors over here who just didn't want there to be access to their little dead-end cul-de-sacs. So that was one compromise. I will give credit there. That was one compromise that was worked out. But it's not, the materials on the building are not good. It turns its back to the river. There's this big, all the parking is here. There's this big concrete wall. So you're walking along the river and all you see is a concrete wall. Versus on the west side. On the east side, because the river was so important, and that's what the community demanded of the developer, you see a green lawn. They tucked their parking in here next to where paperboard was. We should have forced the same thing here. We should have forced them to put their parking on the north side, not the east side. But they thought of the river as an alley, not as a resource. And as a result, we got a much inferior building to the one on the other side. And that's not because I knew that for sure, but that's because I was part of a Milwaukee River work group, and I insisted that the work group have leverage in the discussions. So it wasn't, and to be honest, I think as an alderman, it makes me more powerful. It makes you more powerful to open up the discussion. Because if I'm the only one negotiating and I'm negotiating in private, I'm frankly limited by my own imagination. And no matter how long you've had this job, and no matter how many case studies, and no matter how aware you are, and you think you are, and you start to become an armchair architect if you've had this job for too long, right? So you start to think, oh, I think I know what's going on. But you still are one person, and you still are limited by your own imagination. And there's a real opportunity when you open it up to get new ideas. And you still have the power to say, wait a minute, that idea, oof, but this idea is a good one, let's incorporate that. And so you're able to be the steward and the arbiter of a lot of really smart, creative people. We kind of started this conversation by me saying I feel like the East Side is really unique because it is such a mix of people. And so there is a creativity and an awareness here. And I think the imagination level on the East Side is higher than not just other parts of town, but other parts of the world. I've hung out in rich, Tony parts of Cambridge and Manhattan and so forth. I mean, I know some of those people who have all the degrees and so forth, and they're not necessarily they're limited by their own circle of friends and their own intellectual or cultural or economic class. I really feel like on the east side of Milwaukee, there's really a mingling of professions and classes, and the result is people have pretty interesting, dynamic, strong opinions, but they're also used to everybody else having interesting, dynamic, strong opinions. So I actually find that East Side meetings more often than not police themselves. They don't. People might say something really strong, but then somebody else will respond, and then the room will deal with it, because that's what happens on sidewalks around the East Side all the time. People are used to that. So I actually find it to be very. That's for me the most rewarding part of the job, is getting that kind of feedback on development, because I do think that people always say, oh, there's this danger in design by committee. That's if you're. I think that's a straw man, or whatever they call it. It's really a false negative, in the same way that, oh, you don't want density on Downer Avenue must mean you're pro-suburban. I mean, wanting lots of input and really good input doesn't mean that I'm actually going to make Matt Rinka. I'm not going to have, the lawyer 3 houses down from Matt Rinka's proposal hold the pen while Matt Rinka's drawing the building. I'm just going to make Matt Rinka talk to that lawyer and have that lawyer's, or that university professor who thinks he knows everything. Well, he might know a few things. So Matt, at least listen to him, and then go design the building. That's not designed by committee. That's just, that's brainstorming, and everybody should brainstorm before they design. And then after they design, you should go through a few iterations. But that's one of those boogeyman words that gets tossed around by, I've kind of been through these wars. Interestingly, I've been through these wars. I think one thing that helped me in dealing with how unreasonable D'Amato was being was in New York. I had covered the whole range, and you had some city council members in New York that were unreasonable just like he was. But then you had some that weren't, and you had some that were in the middle. And I'd been to those meetings in Queens and Brooklyn and Manhattan, and I'd seen that go down in other cities. So people in New York are pretty passionate too, I actually think people in Milwaukee, especially on the east side of Milwaukee, are better able to deal with each other's passion than New Yorkers. I mean, New Yorkers tend to be showier, and then tend to sort of go home to their own enclave sometimes. I think on the east side of Milwaukee, there's a more intimate connection between some of the strong opinions than I saw in New York. People in New York would have their strong opinion, present it, almost like a one person play, and then they go home. So they react to each other, but in a kind of blur. I think in Milwaukee, there's time for people to really get to know each other, and so I think the big question of how to keep Downer Avenue strong is to make sure the community stays involved, and to make sure that nobody's just going to come in and tell the community your opinion doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is this particular plan I have for making money. We want you to make money, but we want you to be flexible on the best way to make that money, because you'll probably actually make more money if you listen to these ideas, come up with a better project. But then more importantly too, who's going to shop at these stores? You don't want to come in like an invading army and just tell people it's my way or the highway. You want there to be a sense of community ownership of the commercial spaces, even though it's literally owned by a particular capitalist, of course. They're not the Green Bay Packers, right? There is capitalism going on here on Downer Avenue, which is fine. But I think a smart capitalist on Downer Avenue will engage the community with future projects.
Do you have anything to say? We talked a lot about Downer. We got
Mhm.
into pretty much everything I wanted you to cover.
Mhm.
Talked about stewardship and everything.
Mhm.
Do you know anything about the Charles Alice Museum and Villa Terrace being?
A little bit, although I gotta be honest, I mean, my knowledge of Downer is, I worked at the Popcorn Wagon when I was 11. I stocked shelves for Otto Wentz when I was 15, and then I made calls at Heartland Communication. I made fundraising calls at Heartland Communications, which used to be where the dentist, above the Chancery, and my bedroom window faced, where the parking lot used to be. So I'd hear people coming out of the Chancery, getting into their cars in the surface lot. So I mean, and I know about the fountain. I mean, I can tell you that kind of stuff about Downer. I mean, I take walking tours and I study Milwaukee history, so I could give you the bare bones of the history of Villa Terrace, but I couldn't give you an intimate personal portrait, because even though I lived on Downer and Bellevue, I wasn't hanging out at Villa Terrace when I was a kid.
Do you know anything about the two museums?
Charles Alice?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but most of that as an
Into
adult.
one entity, because they're being managed together when they used to be separate entities.
Yeah. Well, I know. I mean, I can tell you about Museum Mile. If you know about that.
No.
Oh, you should know about that. It's kind of named after, I think, is there a Museum Mile in Chicago, or a Magnificent Mile?
Magnificent Mile.
Yeah, so they're calling it Museum Mile. They've actually had two. I think the second annual one happened recently. I think it was just a month or two ago. Yeah, it was this spring. If you Google Milwaukee Museum Mile, you'll find it. But it is it's the coming together of the Charles Alice, the Villa Terrace, the St. John's Gallery, which is that private residence, but they have a public gallery on the first floor of St. John's, right across from Charles Alice. It is the North Point Lighthouse, and it must be the Jewish Museum, I think. Yeah. So the North Point Lighthouse is kind of a bit of the outlier, but they call it the Mile. So you've got a few of them: the Jewish Museum, the Charles Alice, and the St. John's, and the Villa Terrace, kind of clumped together, and then it just keep going. So their idea, and then I think they have a day where it's free for all five. But the idea is kind of the same principle as Downer Avenue and North Avenue for shopping. Don't come to Downer Avenue because you need to go to Majoli, or because you need a loaf of bread, or because you need a bottle of wine. Come because you can get all three, and you're not sure which three you're going to need. But it's all there. So in the same way, don't say I'm going to Charles Alice or the Villa Terrace. Say I'm just going to head to the east side of Milwaukee to Museum Mile, and I might see 2 or 3 today, and I'm not even sure which 2 or 3 I'll go to. I think it's kind of the idea. They're trying to have that kind of retail Main Street synergy, even though they're lily padded amidst this residential corridor. I've certainly been to Villa Terrace several times. I think it's a great venue. The historic Water Tower neighborhood has had their parties there. I've been there for various events and openings. It's certainly a really grand, amazing space. Although it's like, as grand and amazing as Villa Terrace is, it's not unique. I mean, it's unique in that it's the only museum that has that bluff, but I mean, that bluff goes for a mile, really. And you've got Lake Park, which at any point you can wander down a ravine or take the long way or hills. I mean, there's so many ways to enjoy that bluff. It really makes that bluff is what makes the East Side unique. You know the history of Lake Park?
If you'd like to tell them a little bit.
Well,
one thing that we don't know about is too much is we tried to touch on it about Lincoln Memorial Drive being put down. Do you know the story behind that?
In broad strokes, I know it. Yeah.
We just have little bits and pieces, so as much detail or what you'd like to get into it, that'd be great, because we don't have that on any interview too much except for sentences.
Okay. I think it was the Chicago World's Fair, 1893. I think it was, right? The Devil in the White City, all that stuff. So that was going on. Olmsted was designing the grounds for that. Christian Wall, who Wall Avenue is now named after, went to Chicago to try to convince Olmsted to come to Milwaukee and design a Central Park or a Prospect Park style park on Milwaukee's lakefront. So It's only 90 miles away. He gets Olmsted to come up and take a look. He takes one look at the bluff, says, I'll do it. I mean, it was really the best raw material Olmsted had ever been given. And he made a number of mistakes in Central Park that he half corrected in Prospect Park. I know that from having taken walking tours of both. Central Park, the roads are really not well separated from the other activities. And then but he didn't fix them all. He made a bunch of mistakes in Prospect Park 2 in Brooklyn. When he finally knew what he was doing, he did Lake Park. And it's far superior to either Central or Prospect. Partly because Olmsted finally knew what he was doing and did the ravines and the roads right, so they're truly separate from the park. The walking paths, the horse paths, now car paths, and the passive or active enjoyment of nature and open grass was separated in just the right way. But also the vista of the lake. I mean, you don't. I went to the south of France, I don't know when it was, about 10 years ago. Spent a few days in the south of France. I think they call it the Côte d'Azur, right? No. Côte d'Azur, yeah. I think it means the Blue Coast or something like that. Yeah. And I came home and did my usual jog in Lake Park, and I thought, same difference. But you go there and everyone makes this big deal out of it, and you order wine and you act like you're being fancy, but it's actually better here because there's not salt in the water. And actually the bluff really is more dramatic here than it is anywhere. I don't know about anywhere, but the places I was in Marseille and whatever, it just wasn't. Even though you always have hills coming off of water, I mean, that's the nature of things because water goes down. But to have the bluff as dramatic as we do, anyway, that's the history of Lake Park. And he also designed Newberry Boulevard, which is a big part of the east side, and designed Riverside Park, actually designed an entire boulevard system. Sherman Boulevard connecting to what was then called West Park, but is now Washington Park. And then Layton Boulevard connecting to Cemetery. All of that was an Olmsted sketch, basically. So the bluff used to come right down there. And then we had all this fill from all this urban renewal and other things we were up to, kicking middle-class black people out of their stable neighborhoods and forcing them into public housing, among other things. But more importantly than for clearing way for the freeways and so forth. So we had all this fill. And we wanted to dump it on Lincoln Memorial and create parks. And there were a number of locations. Obviously Lake Park was publicly owned, but there were a number of locations. But Lincoln Memorial wouldn't have worked if it was just Lake Park. So I think including Villa Terrace, all of that, and it wasn't Villa Terrace then, it was a privately owned mansion. So all of those, both north and south of Lake Park, well, mostly south, you had private owners that owned all the way to the lake. So if you're going to put fill down and have cars go down on that fill, you think, how in the world would you ever get everyone's permission to do that, right? So do you know how they did it? Turns out it was easy because of erosion. Those houses would have been eroded within this time frame. So the Lincoln Memorial saved these people's homes, actually, and they were smart enough to know that because it was going, slowly but surely the bluff was coming this way, but Lincoln Memorial and all that fill is a perfect protection. So the bluff would look very different today if we hadn't put down Lincoln Memorial. It would have slowly crept.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
So we haven't heard that side of the story. We heard, how do you feel, or how does your grandmother feel about her home now being public at the bottom instead of having your private lake?
Well, it was a compromise, but I think it was, my understanding, I don't know all these details, and I'm sure if you're interviewing the people whose grandmother signed those easements over, my understanding is that was the main motivation. Obviously, people liked having their own private lakefront, and that is the most valuable thing in real estate, right, is lakefront. So why would anyone willingly sign away lakefront? My understanding is they really would have been in real trouble, and actually you can go up to Shorewood now and see that. There's several houses in Shorewood that are in danger of falling into the lake, including the old UWM house. And actually, it was UWM's fault because they denuded the whole slope, so the old chancellor would have a view of the one I'm talking about. Did you go on the Shorewood Spaces and Traces tour? There's the old chancellor's house, not the one he lives in now, which is on this side of Lake Drive, but it's in Shorewood, up a little ways, right on the lake. And this is 3 or 4 chancellors ago, and so in order to make the view, probably not for the chancellor, probably they were hosting fundraisers or whatever, but they thought, as a lot of people do, wouldn't it be nice to have a great view of the lake? But they chopped down so many trees that then the bluffs, the root balls were gone, and so they started losing the slope. So the new owners have spent, I think, over almost $1 million just to, or I think they said they spent $900,000 to get like 6 feet back, and you can actually see it. You can go up there and see how they're trying to save it, and then their neighbors in the same conundrum. So I think without Lincoln Memorial, a lot of those houses. But I'd be curious to get the first-hand accounts, because I've heard that, I think, from John Gerda, or I don't know where I heard that. I mean, I've heard that from just studying Milwaukee history lately.
It seems like the kind of piece of the puzzle that was missing, because it just did not make sense that people were willing to give that up.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk of socialist mayors and such had a play in it, and it just didn't make sense.
Well, ask them if they got eminent domain. Ask them if any. I mean, people tend to say stuff like that, but I think that can be a simplistic view of history. Ask them if Mayor Frank Zeidler actually or Daniel Hone ever forced their families to sign anything. I'd be curious. I mean, I think they didn't, but I'm not 100% sure. I mean, there is a point there at a certain point, if you have everybody else and you got one hanger on, you can force them into it. But I don't think anyone got forced into it, but I don't know for sure. But so far they've been blaming the socialists for making them do it.
No, that was something that was going on. That's one sort of look at it, and then also that the families that built those homes, or they weren't living in them anymore. They're falling into disrepair, and they're becoming elderly at the time, and the kids didn't want to take care of them because of the such things as heating costs and stuff.
There's some truth in that, yeah. There may have been less of at the timing of that, right? Might have been when there was less stake in the property, but still, why would you sign away lakefront property, even if that house isn't your top priority? You're like, if you own it.
Did you guys interview Pat Fanalier, or was that another group?
We did not. Another.
I think
Spoke with her.
She didn't say what her opinion of it was beforehand, but she seems to be happy that it's there now, and she said it makes her view more interesting.
That's another thing. That the view was then not just the empty seat. There's actually trees at the bottom that they get to look at now too. So it is almost like a beautification of the view that they had that was so beautiful in the first place. Why they put the mansion there, which is kind of interesting on it too. So.
Well, and there used to be mansions all up and down the Prospect Avenue bluff too. But then there's a few left, like the Conservatory of Music, but most of those got replaced for that urban density we're talking about. Which, if it was up to me, I probably would have maybe saved a couple more of the mansions. But there was some call for density there for the same reasons, because people were living differently. I mean, some of these mansions were designed for servants. People don't really have servants in the same way anymore. Although you know where Park Lafayette. This is an interesting bit you guys might like. Park Lafayette, those two big towers, which I think are a little too big, honestly, because I think you should start scaling down as you get into I mean, downtown, make them as big as possible, but then scale it down a bit. But they didn't actually have to tear anything down, or anything substantive down. And do you know why no one ever built a mansion on that site? Because right now you look at it and think of it as a really premier site, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? Where Lafayette kind of curves around, and so Prospect's here and Lafayette's here. It's actually not quite on this map, but it's on that one, yeah. Do you guys know what? Should I point to it, or you know what I'm talking about?
I think I know what you're talking about.
Okay. Well, because now you think of it as this great site, because you've even almost got a better view and you've got a buffer because the bike path comes right by it, which is a nice amenity now. Who wouldn't want to live next to a bike path? But what did the bike path used to be?
Train.
And it used to be like coal. So because that was where the train tracks came closest to the streets, nobody wanted to live there because of all the smoke from the trains. So that you can kind of see there's, in that little node there's a gap where no one put mansions. And you also know the history of North Avenue and why there were so many like, the Kenilworth Dorm used to be a Henry Ford car construction place, and most of North Avenue in that 6 Points area was car. The Prospect Mall was originally a car showroom. That's why some of it's so thickly built. Because when cars first came out, they were like toys for the rich. They weren't what they are now. And people still had their horse and carriage, but the car was like the Sunday drive thing, or the show off thing. So because they still had their horse and carriage, they didn't have anywhere to put the car. So when people first bought cars, they left the car at the lot where they bought it, and when they needed it, they'd call over, and the valet would bring them the car. So you had to locate your car dealerships very close to where the rich people who could afford them lived, so that you could conveniently valet the car to them once they bought it. It was a very brief period, because then it, quickly took off and became the middle class way of getting around. But the history of the big commercial buildings right on Prospect in the north is they were car shops to service the people who lived in the mansions and still had their horse and buggy because they weren't sure the other thing would work out.
We talked a bit about like details before
Mhm.
and how they play a large role in
Yeah.
into the streetscape.
Mm-hmm.
Could you maybe talk your personal opinion about not necessarily restoration, but keeping some of these places? Like you talked about the mansions.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to keep some of these landmarks that aren't actually landmarks now, or
When you say, you mean because some of the old mansions, some of them are in historic districts and some aren't. Is that what you mean?
or some of them might not be labeled a
Yeah.
historic landmark now?
Mhm.
Is that a role that you play as alderman?
Well, we're currently having a discussion about whether to landmark Newberry Boulevard. I don't know if you knew about that, because we've really only been involving the property owners in the discussion so far. We've had a number of meetings, because I think ultimately it's their decision. But you want to ask my opinion of what to expand landmarking or just?
What does it mean? Why would you? I suppose why would you be for it? Why would you want to keep these buildings? What can these buildings tell us in the future if they are kept, or do they hold? You kind of touched on it earlier when you talked about newer establishments coming up and looking to the past to sort of keep within the network or framework of the community or the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
You get a lot of old buildings taken down, and there's history on them.
Yeah.
And new things come up. You sort of lose the history. You also lose an aesthetic that the neighborhood has.
Yeah.
Sort of towards that sort of.
Well, I'd say cities are constantly being built and rebuilt, and I've been following preservation closely in Milwaukee and also in New York. It was always a contentious issue. Although the preservation community, well, there were multiple preservation communities in New York. You had the Municipal Arts Society, the Historic Districts Council, and in Milwaukee you now have Historic Milwaukee and you have the Milwaukee Preservation Alliance. They're working together a bit. So cities are always being built and rebuilt. And if nothing ever got torn down, then there would be a huge call to tear more stuff down. It's very contextual. Like if every building that had ever been built in Milwaukee were still up, we'd have a problem. Okay. But that's generally not the context. There's a natural process. Stuff is getting put up, getting taken down. And so historic preservation only works if it's judicious and picks the right buildings. And less than 1% of the city is currently designated. And yeah, I think here and there, like Newberry is a good example of one we might want to expand it. Here and there, there's room for expansion, but I would not want massive expansion. I think 1% is probably about the right number, frankly. I think 10% would be too much. You want stuff that is truly unique and savable. We don't build them like you used to, but we also used to always, some stuff that's old really is wasn't built well and isn't gonna last. And to some extent, time will just make that decision for you. A well-built building will last. A cheaply built building won't. Market forces or just the force of wind and rain will make that decision for you. But I'd say there's almost two times when preservation becomes really important. One is the last man standing type of preservation, which this is getting a little away from the east side now, but that was why I was so passionate about the Marriott Hotel, which actually ended up being not quite so bad. But what they originally were proposing, which was just to gut that whole block and just put up some new glassy thing. And I've heard some people say, hey, don't we want new glassy things? Are we stuck in the past? And here's where it gets contextual. Well, yes, I want new glassy things. And I wish we had more. We only have one like Chicago-style skyscraper of the second style, that green one on Michigan in the river, or Wisconsin in the river. But let's look at the context. That was the only four-face, four-corner block of 19th century commercial downtown left. Here and there, you'll see 19th century commercial buildings. Look outside City Hall, you'll see a row of them where the Waterfront Deli is. You'll see a row of them on Milwaukee Street, a row of them on Old World 3rd Street, a row of them in 3rd Ward. Well, 3rd Ward, let's put that in its own category. But there's just rows of them. Nowhere was there a whole block, all four corners. It was the last block standing. So to me, I mean, if there were 10 of these, tear 5 of them down, put up all the glassy stuff you want. But there's one left. And yes, it's true that that one block was not the most amazing block. It's not like you look, a couple of the buildings were pretty nice, but you look at all the buildings on that block, you don't go, these are the most amazing, oldest, grandest, it's not the Mitchell and Mackey building or the Grain Exchange or City Hall. But it's the last one left, so why not save it, right? That would be my attitude. I would actually say the East Side is in a different category. It's not a last man standing scenario. It's a cohesive it's not really 19th. I mean, downtown's older than the East Side. So the East Side's probably about 30 to 50 years newer than downtown. So it's early 20th century, most of it. And it's so cohesive and so well built that the natural market forces tear almost none of it down anyway. So that would be like, one time you need to save is when you have a last man standing situation. Or if you have a neighborhood that was built so damn well that you shouldn't change it because it's such a nice neighborhood that everyone has wanted. Since it was built, it's been the place to be. So why mess with a good thing? It's not like, clearly we have a huge need for more density downtown. We've got all these surface lots. We've got entire blocks of surface lots. Downtown needs revitalization. The East Side doesn't need, or the downtown needs reinvention. The East Side doesn't need to be reinvented. It needs to be revitalized. So put it that way. So the East Side, yes, we'd like a little more density on Downer Avenue. We'd like to breathe some new life into some of those old buildings. But take a look at Newbury Boulevard, take a look at Lake Drive, take a look at Lake Park. And I think we got it right the first time. It doesn't mean we don't need to be creative about how to make it continue working, but there's a whole lot more baby than bathwater, would be my point in terms of the built environment on the East Side. Whereas it's sort of the opposite on downtown. We're like, there's just a little bit of baby left. So just put your new glassy building across the street in any direction. This is the one, and actually I do have to give the Marriott credit that they did save not just the facades, but I think 60 feet of Wisconsin Avenue frontage. And what they built on Milwaukee, the point I made earlier about acknowledging, if you take a close look at that, they built, they actually put some depth in the building with some brick, so it wasn't just, it would have looked terrible if it was just one of these flat modern buildings like the Latitude next to these old brick buildings with a little bit of articulation in the window frames. They matched that, and they also put some glass, even though the whole thing's bigger than both of the buildings on either side of it, the Johnson Bank and the E-Line building, they did put some glass up on either side at different levels to acknowledge the building on either side. So I think it was, they showed an awareness of their context. And I think they fit in without mimicking. So I think they did a reasonably good job there. Even though that's not the plan I voted against. Interesting. The plan I voted against was wholesale demolition. Then after they got permission to do whatever they wanted, they realized, actually, those critics were half right. We should maybe not do exactly what we said we were going to do. But they just wanted to prove that they could break the zoning. So that was, the end result there ended up being not nearly as bad as Downer Avenue, but it was kind of a similar mentality through the approval or the entitlement process of, the critics are crazy. Anyone who tells you they don't like our plan is just against everything. And I think the proof's in the pudding, where at least the Marriott, despite being ham-handed and bullyish about jamming their approvals through, at least they then changed course of their own free will and said, actually, you guys were half right. We're going to change this building around. God, I wish that had happened on Downer. I wish they jammed through the approvals and then went, okay, let's take a deep breath and not build something quite so ugly and useless. But they did it. It would have been a really nice opportunity for them to have noticed that the critics were maybe about half right.
Is the wound still healing there? That talks of. I mean,
Well, it depends on what you mean by wound. I mean, I mean, when you build something that useless and that ugly in the middle of such an important, iconic district, I don't even know if wound is the right word. I mean, you don't. When you screw up a building, that screw up lasts as long as the building is up. So I don't know if I mean, maybe you meant emotional wound.
Yeah, I meant the neighborhood. Are they still? Have they gotten past it yet, or are they still hurt about it? And would it be? It just seems like, what do you do to a big mistake except just push it to the side and start over? But is there time and money and effort to actually push that aside right now? I guess I'm getting at.
What do you mean by push it aside?
Is there a chance to put something new there, or?
Oh, on that exact site?
Push it aside and knock it down. Yeah. or what do you do? I mean, can you?
Well,
can
for
you
me,
turn
I mean,
that into
I'd
something?
like to. My claim is I moved on from even before I got elected, in the sense that I'm very critical of what happened, and I'm certainly not mincing words now, talking about who screwed up and how they screwed up. But Mike D'Amato is currently lobbying for Joel Lee, which is kind of proves the point. He's now actually getting paid by Joel Lee to be a lobbyist, right? Which to me is very unseemly, but so be it. But I take Joel Lee's calls. I take Mike D'Amato's calls. I call them when they did a streetscape. I work with them to get more city funding to do it right. So, I mean, to me, it healed even before I got elected, because the purpose of these kinds of community discussions is not to prove you're right. It's to get it right. Like, I've been proven right. It was a terrible idea to do that garage. The voters proved it right. They elected me, so even, but so what? We still got an ugly building there. So the point is not to be right, it's to get it right. And so to me, the way you got to work around it. I mean, you said push it to the side. Listen, if Joel Lee came to me tomorrow and said, I got this great new plan that involves tearing that parking garage down and putting the parking where it always should have been, incorporating it more on the Stoll side or on the edge of the district, of course I'll say let's do it. I'm just not hopeful that'll ever happen, because I'm sure he's still got, I mean, the building cost $20 million, and I'm sure there's still quite a bit of debt on that building. So just realistically, I would never expect that proposal to happen. I would welcome it, but I wouldn't demand it, because it just doesn't seem realistic. I mean, you've got to work with people. Yeah, in a perfect world, does that thing go away and something better replace it? Of course. But I just don't see that happening soon, from a realistic perspective. So the way I would handle it is you try to, well, for one thing, I want to be finally proven wrong. I want that proven at least half wrong. I mean, the building's going to be ugly forever, but it doesn't have to be useless forever. It's currently useless. No one is parking there. One conversation I've had with Joel Lee and with his lobbyist D'Amato is make sure that whatever you build there is underparked, and that you're going to basically force people in the hotel across the street to use that parking. Don't just don't tell me that, oh, we've leased it up to the medical offices so we don't have spots available, because even though he's leased it to them, they're not parking there. They're parking on the street, right? So force shared parking. Force the medical office to share that parking with your hotel banquet. I would much rather, even though it would prove me wrong, I would much rather come up with a new plan that actually gets that ugly parking garage used, because at least then it won't be useless. So to me, I want to be practical, and I don't want to force the developer to spend millions of dollars to do even more parking that won't get used, because that's really the biggest bane of both the financing and the aesthetics of downtown architecture. I give a tour for Historic Milwaukee. I'll be giving it in September for Doors Open, called How to Build a Better Car Trap, where we talk about how ugly, because actually as ugly as the Downer parking garage is, it's not nearly as ugly as half the stuff downtown. I mean, building ugly parking structures is not something that Scott Kindness and Dean Greenstreet invented. Okay, they built an ugly one, and there's a long line of architects that have had a hard. There's only two good ones really, though. The one on the Art Deco one on Mason and Water, and then the Gimbels one, which is landmarked. There's some that aren't. There's ways to do it so they're not terrible, but there's ways to do it that are even worse than the Downer one. And all you need to do is walk in any direction in 3 blocks from this building and you'll see about 3 in any direction. You know, they're pretty obvious. So it's a real challenge, and but once they're built, I mean, tearing them down is generally not practical. So my solution, not just on Downer, but on North the hospital parking garage on North is way worse than the one on Downer. I mean, it's deeply offensive. I mean, it's not, the only reason it doesn't get more attention is it's not like it's not in the middle of a historic commercial district right next to a historic residential district. Which, again, the idea that you'd put this really awful thing right at the crossroads of all that. But the North Avenue one, if you stand at Patty's Pub and look east, you'll see a much worse parking structure. So it's not a unique problem. I mean, it's a legitimate conundrum. How do you get parking into these dense areas that are charming? And part of the reason they're charming is they're not ugly. So once you get people there, you make the place ugly and then you ruin it. I mean, it is a real challenge, financing and architecture-wise. It's a huge challenge. And so that would be how I see Downer going, that we would hopefully get a hotel or an apartment, hopefully with, similar to the way the Marriott saved 30, 60 feet of facades. I mean, they have that whole vacant lot on the Stoll side. Work with that, try to save the historic nature of the buildings there. Build something a little denser, but that's set back so it doesn't overwhelm the street. Exactly how dense and how high is to be determined. It'll be controversial probably, but I'm certainly open to that conversation. But then make it a little less tall because you don't park it quite as heavy, because you make them park where you've got 100 unused spots. Now, the one downside of doing it that way is it probably makes it harder to then tear that garage down in the future. But anytime someone spends $20 million on something, you can't expect them to tear it down. So I feel like, from a practical point of view, I feel like we're stuck with it. So let's at least make it useful, and let's at least make that one ugly thing help the other nearby things be less ugly. And by less ugly, I mean let's not have quite so much parking in them, which would force them up and higher and compromise the pedestrian experience, because you'll have blank walls on the ground level. And it's expensive to build covered parking. So that's how I see it realistically. I'm sure there's a lot of people in the neighborhood who would just like to see that thing down tomorrow. I don't disagree with them. I just don't see that as being, it's hard for me to see that being a likely economic scenario for the current owner. And you got to work with the economic constraints of property owners. I mean, that's part of this business. I mean, we control the zoning, we control city subsidies, but generally speaking, we're dealing with other people's land. And so if they don't like it takes two. You need both. You need city willingness to participate in changing zoning for people or accommodating people's visions, but without people's visions, city can't make you do it. I mean, we could. I mean, we can buy land and build, but that's usually not how cities do well, by building it themselves. Although we did a nice job with City Hall, sort of. I mean, there's some problems, but overall, I mean, this is a city-built building, but it's the exception, not the rule. I think most of your grand buildings are going to be privately built. And does that answer your question about preservation?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
that's great. Did you have anything? How are we running on time? How's your time?
I'm good. I have something in a little while, but not immediately.
I think we covered what I wanted to talk about, the balance between preservation and development, ownership as stewardship, and
Yeah.
I think we should ask the alderman if he has any further comments.
Yeah. Is there anything that you would like to say as I guess keeper of the neighborhood, or steward of the neighborhood?
Well, I mean, I'd say in general that you've got, on one side you have the best park in the world, and on the other side, well, you're just doing the east side. But I think of when I think of the east side, I think of Lake to River, or even crossing the river sometimes, because that's my district. But when you look at the east side, you've got the best lake in the world on one side, and you've got the most expansive and secluded seeming urban river wilderness in the world that I know of. I don't know of any other river valley in the middle of of a downtown, or maybe not in the middle of a downtown, but within a mile of a downtown, where you really feel like you're in the middle of nowhere. And so I think being flanked by that, I mean, the river and the lake is the whole reason the East Side is where it is historically, even going back to the natives. Oh yeah, I should show you this book actually. You guys know about all the mounds?
Yeah, there were about
And you know that-
400.
Yeah, and you know there's only one left, and you know it's in Lake Park?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the increased Lapham mapped out all this stuff. All of these are gone except the one in Lake Park. But you can see some of this is actually throughout Wisconsin, but let me find the Milwaukee parts.
There is one more question I'd like to ask.
Okay. Actually just made, they're in here somewhere. I just made copies of the relevant parts, yeah. So you can kind of see. Between the lake and the river has always been going back, because these are 1,000 years old. Like the Potawatomi, have no idea what these things are. Potawatomi actually were in Michigan a couple hundred years ago. But even the Menominee and the Winnebago, who have been here longer than the Potawatomi, they don't have an oral history of this stuff. This stuff was from the people whose main center of civilization was Cahokia outside St. Louis and Astalon. You've been to Astalon? So there was 1,000 years ago, or between 1,500 and 1,000 years ago, these conical and effigy or spirit animal shaped mounds were being built.
Is it part of the Hopewell?
Yeah, it's the Hopewell culture, yeah. So we've got archaeological stuff about it. We don't really have a coherent oral history of it because there's been movement since pre-European contact because we're going back 1,000 years. But anyway, my point is, you can see that this area has always been a sacred and habitated spot. People have always been curious about it and wanted to live here, where the rivers meet. And because of this bluff line, this was just a natural spot. I mean, it's all marshy over here. I mean, this is the natural spot to put your good buildings. And so I think that geography has given us the river, valley, and lake park, which are unequaled, especially the proximity of them to each other. And so the people that get to live between those two things are very lucky. But then the institutions they've created, like the university, the hospital, the museums, has I think if you look back over the last 100 years, East Siders have been good stewards of what they've been given, and we've been given a lot.
Going back to childhood memories,
Mhm.
You're well known as an athlete or
Uh-huh.
someone who's interested in sports.
Yeah.
What was it like playing in the neighborhood? Were there
Oh, yeah.
certain areas you could play in?
Yeah, well, I used to play soccer in Lake Park, and then also Little League was in Lake. I mean, speaking of Lake and Riverside Park, that's where I played Little League baseball. There's diamonds in both, even though that would offend Olmsted. Olmsted didn't want active; he wanted passive Sunday church clothes enjoyment of nature. But yeah, I played Little League in both parks. I played soccer as a kid in Lake Park, and then played soccer as a high school student in Riverside Park. So for me, some of my fondest memories are walking from my house down Newberry Boulevard to Riverside High School, and then playing soccer there after school and walking home. Sometimes I'd even leave my cleats on, because you can just walk home on the boulevard. It's in grass. Nobody takes your cleats off. Playing football in Newberry Boulevard. I mean, if you want to go way back, I mean, we stopped playing tackle football once we all grew or could grow beards. But when we were like 10, 11, we played a lot of tackle football on Newberry Boulevard because the trees are like perfect first down markers. So, having all that greenery makes it a lot easier to be a kid and to meet other kids and to have those kinds of experiences. It'd be hard for me to imagine growing up in a neighborhood where you didn't have, Lake Park, Newberry Boulevard, Riverside Park. I mean, it's high standards. I mean, there's a reason I'm still around. I mean, there's not a whole lot of places where you have that much greenery so nearby. But then you also have basketball courts. I mean, I still remember, actually, I was just talking about this on my radio show on the Packerverse. We were talking about the psychology of sports, and my buddy who lives out in San Francisco, who also grew up in the East Side, had read this book, and he was talking about mirror neurons and how watching sports can help you play sports. And I still have a very vivid memory of the 2001 Milwaukee Bucks. So I would have been, how old would I? I mean, I would have been an adult, would have been in my early 20s in 2001. But I don't know if do you guys remember Big Dog and Sam Cassell and Ray Ray? I mean, part of it came back to me because Ray Ray just made that big shot. But the way those guys played, they were so smooth. And they didn't always, there weren't that many layups, but they all could make anything between 5 to 30 feet. They could make it, and they had their spots, and the way they would just get to their spots and be open, and you had 3 shooters. So I remember watching them play against the Sixers, and the series was fixed. We should have beat them, but the refs called all those fouls in games 5 and 7. But I think it was game 4 or game 6 where we just dominated them, won by like 30 points. And like I just immediately like ran out of my house, went to Maryland, ran out of my parents' house. I think where I don't know if I was living there at the time or I probably was just visiting. I must have been in town for the summer. I can't remember the details. But I definitely remember running to Maryland Avenue and immediately joining a pickup game and playing the best basketball I've ever played in my life after having watched those guys play. So you got Maryland, you got Hartford, a lot of basketball courts, a lot of chances for kids to be kids, which is one of the reasons why this map is sort of so terrifying. You know, if these red dots keep spreading, I mean, you want some red dots, but because you got a university there, you need renters. I mean, that's part of it. But if it becomes like, if more blocks become like this where it's all renters, what that means is there's no families with kids.
So you see, it does seem like the age demographic is different.
Mm-hmm. And
the historic water tower neighborhood.
Oh yeah, you can see from this map too. You can see how little red there is as you get east. But I mean, it's a neighborhood designed for everyone, but it's especially a great neighborhood to be a kid in because of Lake Park, River Park, and Newberry Boulevard, and then Hartford and Maryland School and the courts. And so it, you know, if there's a part of Milwaukee that's definitely better than the suburbs, even if you're the kind of person that might otherwise like the suburbs, it's the east side. It's clearly got everything the suburbs have and more. And so, but maintaining we lose people to Shorewood and Whitefish Bay a lot because of the school system. So actually, I think that's probably the bigger challenge is making people re-engage with the Milwaukee Public Schools, combined with the challenge of, you know, absentee landlords and student renters. But I think we're getting a handle on that. I think that's a solvable problem, or not solvable. It's a manageable issue, but getting people re-engaged with the public schools would probably be my biggest priority. We just did a survey, got a couple hundred responses about people's opinions about the local schools. So I'm going to attempt, along with the local school board director and neighborhood leaders, to try to re-engage people in Hartford and Riverside. Well, Maryland's already got East Siders going there, but I think maybe telling the story of the public schools and when people have gone there historically versus now, I mean, is actually a really big part of the story, because without that, everything else crumbles. I know 2 people personally that I went to high school with that just moved to Shorewood when their kids turned 4.
I think we better wrap it up.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you guys.
It's really great. One of the most in-depth interviews that we had.
Okay.
Really, really thank you deeply.
Okay.
We got a lot of good information and things that we were unable to touch on.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for being so precise in what we wanted to talk about and really getting into depth on your side.
Mm-hmm.
I made a note about that, North Ave dorms.
Okay.
That you said you didn't know.
Yeah.
So if you want to put it in pen or rephrase it.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. One of my best friends, kind of my partner, is working on this startup company in Cambridge, using a web tool for residents to give their feedback on development issues.
Mm-hmm.
He got the city bike share program, has commissioned him to create a website where residents can give their feedback on where they would like the locations to be, new locations.
Oh, of
to
the bike
be.
shares?
Yeah, and he's looking at making it a larger business model. These forums where people get the facts about development and also can give their feedback.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, well let me know how that goes, or send me a link. Because although to me there's no substitute for just a good in-person meeting. Because I think sometimes these issues are so subtle and complicated that if you just sit at home at your own computer, your own opinion can, you know, you need to kind of, the developer needs to hear from you, but you also need to hear from the developer. you know, and you know, the developer sort of needs to explain, hey, here's my constraints, I need to do this, but I gotta do this. And so I think that back and forth can be invaluable. But yeah, but we're trying, with the school survey, we're doing it all on the internet.
Are you publishing those results, or?
Yeah, but we have to almost should have planned it out better. We like asked too many questions, because we got like a couple hundred responses, and it's like, okay, now what? Because because we asked like 10 questions per school, and we also asked for demographic tags, and so you almost want to like look for a pattern. But we have a summer intern who's actually a recent Riverside graduate, so we're going to assign it to her to try to make some sense of it all. But no, we got a lot of very good essay responses. People were very thoughtful. So yeah, we're definitely we're gonna make it public, but exactly how to make it public or how to, because I don't think we're not just gonna show everybody all 200 surveys. I don't know yet how we're gonna present it, but I'm sure people are gonna start asking soon. I took the survey. What are the results? But it was really a first step. It's not like there's not like a specific decision that's about to be made. It was more just for us, like a general, two things. Like we want to know, are the people's perceptions of the schools accurate? Because it could be that people think a school doesn't have something that they actually have. Like with Hartford, people probably don't know they still have a librarian and they still have good arts and music. So if people just have the inaccurate impression of Hartford, we want to just correct that impression. So then it's just a PR issue. On the other hand, if people's main complaint is the test scores aren't competitive with the suburbs and the class sizes are too high, it's like, well, that's true. So then it's more like, well, then now how do we change Hartford to make you want to go there? So that was kind of the purpose of the survey, was just to get a sense of, do people have an accurate impression or inaccurate? So half of it's PR, half of it's, well, I don't know how we lower class sizes with no money, that's the problem.
Would you mind if we got an image of you somewhere for
Yeah, what, you want me to give you a picture, or you want to take one?
we'd like to take one.
Okay, that's fine.